some sources that we can use in order to get unbiased and factual news so that we can work to restore civility and not be part of the problem?
I would, and no source is going to be perfect, of course. And I think, performing the due diligence to truly understand an issue and become informed on an issue is critical, especially if that issue is important to you in your life. But I'm a big fan of local news and local newspapers. Reading something written by someone in my community versus a national cable news network, or someone who doesn't have the same investment and care for the place that I live, and who may not see things from the perspective that we do, say, in El Paso, Texas, or that you do in San Marcos, for example. That's really important to me. A harder thing to do now as more local newspapers close, and then trusted national news sources. And depending on your point of view and the opinion page that you like, that might be the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. It may be MSNBC, CNN, Fox. Although I tend to, in terms of really getting informed, I tend to look at print and newspapers more than I do TV. But I'll tell you, Courtney, what I would not do is try to get my information and news through social media and through these platforms where we really are the product. Those companies, Twitter, Snapchat, Facebook, Instagram, make their money based on how often we use it, how engaged we are. And the things that tend to engage us are the sensational, the dramatic, I can't believe this person did this thing to that person. Sometimes those things are true. Very often they are not. And when people begin to organize politically around things that aren't true, in other words, lies, you can get some really perverse and really negative consequences. And I do think, Courtney, that is partly, and maybe in large part, to explain for the polarization that we're seeing in America right now. It is just social media fuel on the fire. And I really hope, it'd be nice if these companies of their own volition began to rework their algorithms that push us towards conflict online. If not, I think some sensible regulation protecting First Amendment rights, but in ensuring that there's some premium placed on the truth. We know those First Amendment rights are not absolute. In other words, there are limits on them. Famously, you cannot yell fire in a movie theater, but you also shouldn't be able to lie on a social media platform where perhaps millions of people will traffic in that lie and cause some real negative consequences for others. So that's probably my where I'd go to and where I'd probably stay away from. Doesn't mean don't use social media. I just would not use it as your primary source for being informed on what's happening in your community or in the country.
Do you feel that diversity and inclusion and inclusivity is a step towards restoring civility back to our discourse?
I think the answer is yes. And we should be thinking about, talking about, and acting on real representation in every aspect of our lives. And that includes the way that we are informed about what is happening in our world. To whom is it happening? Who is the actor? Who's the subject and object in a given story? Who's included? Whose voice is heard and therefore listened to and understood, and who's ignored completely? I think that to look at the events of this past week, it'd be really interesting to review the stories that were reported out and where they were reported from and who was included in them. Literally what communities, where geographically were the reporters, and whose lives were represented, on a newscast or in a newspaper article, and then who was doing the reporting, and what is their perspective and understanding and experience and contribution to that story. So Armando, absolutely. And I think that it's hard to hate somebody It's hard to demonize or vilify when you begin to understand them and you get to know them and you can see things from their perspective and, virtually try to walk a mile, at least a couple of blocks in their shoes. I think that the best way to do that is to be there presently with the people who you seek to understand and to listen to them and to have what I've heard described as a radical empathy in seeking to understand their experience. But we can't always do that, and we can't be everywhere, and we can't see everyone at once. And so thinking about that in our news sources is really, really important. I'm so glad that you mentioned that and brought that up. And that should inform also where we get our news and the way in which we stay informed about what's going on in the world.
Dr. Nagando talked about echo chambers on social media, and I think that's really prevalent right now because you want to read things that you believe in and that align with what you're interested in. And I'm curious if you take echo chambers and you apply that to the news, do you feel like there are some news sources that could also be considered echo chambers? CNN leans a lot bit more to the Democratic side, Fox going towards the Republican side. And what are some sources that report maybe a little bit more aligned to the middle, and that you could kind of step out of your echo chamber and hear more about what's happening without maybe some of those colored lenses?
Courtney, there is a fascinating podcast episode of The Daily that I listened to today, and it was a kind of an episode focused on the life of Rush Limbaugh and talked about his rise as a radio personality and a really important policy change that was made in 1987 around the fairness doctrine. And that used to hold, as I'm sure you know, that if a certain point of view was shared on the public airwaves, radio or broadcast, then if someone wanted to respond to that, they were essentially, ideally going to be afforded some kind of equal time. If someone was attacked, they could respond. And towards the end of the Reagan administration, that fairness doctrine was repealed, and radio hosts, and he wasn't the only one, but like Rush Limbaugh, took full advantage of that. And it really, and you may like him, you may not like him, you may have listened to him, you may not even know who he is, but he forever changed media in this country and allowed for a much more caustic and confrontational and any way you cut it, disrespectful way of approaching news issues and people. And I think you can see a through line from that moment in time in our history to where we are today, and some of that confrontation that has become such a mainstay of our politics. The thing is, I don't think it has to be that way. You meet someone in person, and it's really hard to say something ugly to them in their face, right? We know that. That's just a given. The more distance you have from someone, the less eye contact you have to make with them, the shield that you have from any kind of accountability or repercussions from your actions or your words, the more likely you are to be tempted into saying something really vile or ugly or mean, or perhaps even harassing. And that to me is very much what I see on social media platforms today. So what's the solution to that? I think more in-person engagement. I was mentioned I was in North Texas earlier this week, up in Rains County, and we had it was a part of Texas that did not yet have drinking water, at least the part of the community we were visiting. And we'd been able to find a pallet of water in Waco, and we'd driven it up there, and we met people in the community who wanted to help distribute that water. And the first person that I meet is wearing a Trump Make America Great Again mask. And I immediately think, well, this guy's not going to like me because I happen to be a Democrat, and I'm probably not going to like him because he happens to be a Trump supporter. And the thing is, once we started distributing the water and talking to one another and listening to each other, I mean, we were both focused on the same task at hand, which was helping people in that community. We both saw each other as a human being affected by this crisis in Texas. We both knew the other wanted to do the right thing, and we're probably going to disagree on a lot of other things beyond that. But that's not somebody that I would vilify or say something mean about, especially after having the chance to meet him. So I don't know how we work that into our lives, right? Especially in the midst of a pandemic, finding a way to have human face-to-face contact with people. And then especially, you mentioned echo chambers, Courtney, especially seeking out those who don't feel the way we do about everything, who don't come to the same conclusions on the issues that are most important to us. And in fact, trying to find those who come to a different conclusion and understanding why. And maybe at the end of the day, you don't disagree, but maybe you find some common ground. And at a minimum, you see that person as your fellow Texan, your fellow American, your fellow human being. I think that is could be a big step towards more civility in America.